Have you been lied to about sports nutrition, specifically carbohydrate intake and exercise performance? A recent article published in Endocrine Reviews has been stirring up all the coaches and influencers on this topic. Now, this review paper published this month is entitled Carbohydrate Ingestion on Exercise Metabolism and Physical Performance by Noakes and colleagues. And it synthesizes 100 years of research on this very, very topic. Now, before we get into it, welcome to the Vitality Manifesto podcast. I'm Dr. Dwayne Jackson, Yale-trained medical scientist and educator, exercise physiologist, health and performance specialist, and lifelong athlete. Now, before we dig into this paper and give you some actionables and everything out of it, let's start with some basic exercise physiology to get everyone on the same page, especially in the realm of carbohydrates and how they're stored and everything in the body. So when people hear the term carbs or blood sugar, it sounds like one big energy pool. But actually, your body has three different carbohydrate banks, so to speak, and they all do a different job. So the first bank we're going to talk about is muscle glycogen, your local locked-in fuel. And you could think of muscle glycogen as a stash of gasoline stored right inside every muscle. It's made from carbohydrates you've eaten, and it's packed away directly into these muscle fibers. Now, when that muscle contracts hard, say during sprinting or climbing a hill or lifting a weight, it burns mostly from its own local tank. Now, importantly, that glycogen is locked in place. The biceps can't send its glycogen to your brain. Your quads can't loan theirs to your heart. And, generally speaking, it is there for performance for the muscle fibers that are interacting with that glycogen. Now, during harder efforts, muscle glycogen breaks down. It provides the majority of energy for skeletal muscle contraction. And that's generally at intensities above 85% of max aerobic capacity or VO2 max. So muscle glycogen is your local performance fuel, and it's used especially for intense or repeated efforts. Now, next we have liver glycogen, and this is your central blood sugar stabilizer, so to speak. Liver glycogen is more like your checking account. It's also stored carbohydrate, but it's in the liver, not in the muscles. And its main job is to keep blood sugar steady by dripping glucose out into the bloodstream between meals and during exercise. Now, when exercise goes on for hours, liver glycogen can get used up to maintain that blood glucose. So liver glycogen's job is to protect your blood sugar, and through that, it protects your brain. And of course, we have the third pool, which is our blood sugar, which is topped up by foods we eat or by the liver, just like we just discussed. Now, back to the article and why it's causing a buzz in the industry. The paper basically asks the question, what if in most real-world races and workouts, you don't stop because your muscles ran out of glycogen, but you stop because your brain is quietly pulling the plug to protect itself from low blood sugar? Now, in my eyes, this isn't some mind-blowing hypothesis. Endurance athletes have known about this for decades, at least anecdotally. They call this the bonk. And it's why a lot of endurance-based carbohydrate supplements, when they're formulated, they contain fructose, which is a carb source that preferentially replenishes liver glycogen. But there's still something to learn from this latest paper. And to frame this, it helps to separate two things. First, what fuels the muscle, and then second, what actually stops you from going faster or doing another rep. Now, for a long time, sports science told us a very simple story. Muscle glycogen is the main fuel for exercise, and when glycogen is depleted, you fatigue. And that idea came out of the old biopsy studies where higher pre-exercise glycogen let the athletes go longer at around 75% of VO2 max, and low glycogen was associated with earlier fatigue. But the newer work has gone back through over 100 years of data and asked a harder question. Is it really muscle glycogen running out that stops you, or is it something else? Now, in the review paper by Noakes and colleagues, they argue that the key limiting factor in prolonged endurance exercise is not a literal energy crisis in the muscle, but rather falling blood glucose and brain protection. And they make several key points. First, exercise-induced hypoglycemia, or low blood sugar, or EIH as they call it, correlates strongly with exercise termination, whereas muscle glycogen utilization by itself does not cause failure to move or whole body collapse. At least 10 different studies show that muscle ATP does not fall to failure levels at fatigue, even in prolonged or high intensity exercise. Now, if there were a true energy crisis, so to speak, you'd expect ATP to crash and the muscles lock up. That essentially never happens. Now, second, carbohydrate taken during these prolonged exercise events mainly prevents or reverses this drop in blood glucose. It also stabilizes brain fuel supply and delays central fatigue. It does not primarily work by refilling muscle glycogen in real time. And then third, high-fat adapted athletes can oxidize fat at extremely high rates, higher than we ever predicted, even at more than 85% of VO2 max, and can match performance despite lower glycogen and lower carbohydrate oxidation. That challenges the whole idea that carbohydrate is obligatory fuel at high intensity. And fourth, the main practical benefit of carbohydrate before and during long events is to protect blood glucose in the brain, especially once you go beyond about 2 or 3 hours of performance, or when liver glycogen and gluconeogenesis capacity are limited. So for marathons and ultra endurance athletes and these types, the modern picture is fat plus endogenous glycogen can cover most of the mechanical work. The key safety issue is blood glucose and brain energy, not empty muscles. Now, with that backdrop, let's come back to other questions that have spawned in the socials and everywhere else from this latest review paper. First, is muscle glycogen depletion still a relevant issue for people who rely on heavy aerobic power to, do their job? Sprinters, middle distance athletes. And second, what about strength training, where sets last 15 to 20 seconds and anaerobic glycolysis plays a big role? So let's first start with sprint and middle distance events. At intensities above roughly 85% VO2 max, muscle glycogen breakdown through anaerobic glycolysis provides most of the ATP for muscle contraction. So yes, glycogen is very active during those efforts. But crucially, a single all-out bout is extremely unlikely to fully deplete whole muscle glycogen. Instead, two more nuanced concepts matter. One is local glycogen pools inside muscle fibers, or intramyofibrillar glycogen. This is the glycogen that sits right next to the contractile machinery in the muscle. This seems particularly important for normal calcium handling and force production, especially in prolonged repeated work. Those pools can be significantly reduced even when whole muscle glycogen is still well above zero. So if you're doing repeated sprints, hard surges, hill repeats, or trying to preserve the ability to kick in hard at the end of a race, low or even subcellular glycogen can start to matter for performance. Now, the second concept is that in about 1 hour of high intensity efforts, fatigue is not tightly linked to either glycogen depletion or exercise-induced hypoglycemia. Other factors actually become dominant: metabolite accumulation, ion handling issues, and centrally regulated reductions in motor unit recruitment. Now, in practice, for sprinters and middle distance runners, muscle glycogen is relevant, but mostly in terms of, can you repeat high intensity bouts with short recovery? Or can you preserve your ability to produce a big anaerobic effort late in a race? It's not usually a case of, I'm going to hit a wall because my tank went to zero in a single sprint. Now let's turn to strength training, where sets last 15 to 20 seconds. That time domain sits right in the sweet spot where phosphocreatine and anaerobic glycolysis are both very, very active. So yes, glycogen is being broke down during those sets, and the total energy cost of that glycogen, though, especially with a single 15 to 20 second set, is going to be relatively modest. So from a practical perspective, several lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion. First, increasing pre-exercise muscle glycogen through carbohydrate loading does not reliably improve high intensity or maximal efforts. Second, in rodent models, animals that are unable to synthesize muscle glycogen do not necessarily show impaired endurance or high intensity performance, while those engineered to store extra muscle glycogen do not automatically perform better. So in contrast, animals with more liver glycogen do show better endurance because they maintain blood glucose more effectively. And then thirdly, in human strength and resistance training systematic reviews, they don't find consistent benefits of higher carbohydrate intake on acutely measured strength performance, especially when the sessions are typical in volume and rest periods. So what does this mean in the gym? Well, for most lifters doing 15 to 20-second sets with generous rest in between them, glycogen is used, but it's not really the limiting factor. What stops the set is local metabolite buildup, hydrogen ions, motor unit recruitment strategies, task failure, not an empty tank. The situations where glycogen really become more limiting in that context anyway are narrower. For example, very high volume sessions with lots of sets, short rest, and large muscle groups. So think of like a really big voluminous leg day. 2-a-day training will do this, or heavy resistance training layered on top of substantial endurance work. Training in a chronically low carbohydrate or semi-fasted state over multiple days where muscle glycogen never ever reaches its peak and never ever restores. Under those circumstances, you can gradually deplete local glycogen enough to actually impair that performance, especially in the later sets or in later sessions. This will start to slip for those fuel kind of related reasons. But generally speaking, in a well-fed mixed diet athlete lifting 3 to 5 times per week with normal training volumes, performance is very unlikely to be limited by glycogen availability anyway, per se. So if we put this together, for sprint and middle distance athletes, muscle glycogen is still highly relevant as the primary substrate for anaerobic glycolysis at race pace, especially when you look at repeated efforts and late race surges. However, the modern evidence suggests that acute whole muscle glycogen depletion is rarely the true limiter in single events of that duration. Other regulatory mechanical factors step in before you literally run out of glycogen. Now, for strength training sets of 15 to 20 seconds, anaerobic glycolysis is heavily involved, and glycogen is the carbohydrate source behind that. But the total glycogen drain per set is relatively small. Provided then, that overall carbohydrate intake is reasonable, glycogen is not usually what caps your performance in those short sets. Instead, the relevant questions really become, are you doing so much total work or stacking so many sessions that glycogen restoration can't keep up? And are you chronically restricting carbohydrates to the point that local muscle glycogen stays low day after day? People who have done carb depletion strategies for bodybuilding shows or to make weight for strength events know what it feels like to actually deplete muscle glycogen and try to perform. It definitely does make a difference when we're depleted versus when we're topped up. But only in those cases really does glycogen availability start to look like a primary constraint for short, anaerobically focused training. Now, as we land this plane, the practical takeaway from all this is that for most sprint and middle distance athletes, and for most lifters doing 15 to 20 second sets, it's worth keeping glycogen reasonably topped up across the week. But there is little evidence that maximal glycogen loading is the key to a single sprint or a single middle distance race, or even, a short, single short lifting set, or, a very small volume workout. Fueling strategies should be built around the total volume and the frequency of high intensity work, and around protecting blood glucose in long events, more than around chasing muscle glycogen or maximizing muscle glycogen for those very short anaerobic efforts. And that, my friends, is everything in a nutshell, and it is it for today's episode. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to my channel, hit like, share, and comment with any questions you have. And until next time, stay informed, stay strong, and get sweaty every day. Thanks for listening.